What if I told you there was a brawler who was a viable meta option for nearly 7 years total, one of the longest reigns in Brawl Stars history that completely destroyed the typical rise and fall cycle most brawlers experience? A brawler whose success became so normal, players started taking it for granted, before it all was taken away like a massive distant memory. That brawler is none other than your favorite legendary cactus, Spike. I think players who didn't experience the full extent of his reign might not realize how insane this really was, and veteran players might have even forgotten since Spike has experienced fall-offs more recently. But even if you take more conservative estimates for Spike's viability, we can still safely assume Spike has been good across several years when you add it all up. At least 5.5 years total, longer than many of you have even played the game. Spike may not literally be the best brawler across history, but he's often been seen as such by the casual player base, especially since his general use rate is significantly higher than other consistent brawlers. But what made Spike so consistently good? What falls in the meta did Spike experience, and why do I think his history as a solid brawler is now problematic? Those are the questions we'll answer today, but I'm getting ahead of myself. To lay the groundwork, we have to go all the way back to 2017, Brawl Stars' beta release, and our first sighting of Spike himself. Spike was just one of 15 original brawlers in Brawl Stars' beta release, a time of discovery and experimentation for the game. Vertical gameplay, a different attacking system, every brawler looking chopped. I've covered this before, but beta is wild to look back on. But during beta, how good was Spike actually? The answer was pretty good, but not for the exact same reasons he was later. Spike actually released pretty broken, but almost no one got to experience that broken state. He got his most dramatic nerf of beta less than 2 weeks after it released, a whopping 14% health nerf only 12 days after beta launched, which in game balancing terms is a big deal. So while Spike was a lot beefier than he should have been right out the gate, he was in the same health bracket as Jesse above all the sharpshooters, throwers, and Crow. Almost no one got to see it because everyone's accounts were so new. Unlocking Spike was still a matter of RNG, and it would take most players several months to get their first legendary. Just like today, he still shot out this long-range main attack that split off into exactly 6 spikes. Because of this fundamental mechanic, Spike always played best at close range because more of his spikes land at point blank. This made him what is commonly referred to as an anti-tank brawler, a community term that's pretty self-explanatory. I mean, just read the label, but it's what Brawl Stars officially calls a damage dealer and is the main counter to tanks as well as assassins sometimes. This class is abundant today, but obviously had way fewer options back then since there were only 21 brawlers towards the end of beta. And what was so interesting about Spike was that he was basically the founder of the modern anti-tank role. Spike not only had really high burst damage, but also a good range, 2 attributes that, funnily enough, not a single other beta brawler possessed at the time. Slap that on top of Spike's super being the first slowing ability in the entire game, and you've got Spike feeling like an all-rounder superpower during this undeveloped meta. There was no Otis, Chester, Colette. Even Crow played a lot more like a proper assassin at the time, meaning Spike had a pretty exclusive job as a long-ranged anti-tank. This unique role made Spike feel even more legendary than his mechanics alone. But on top of being essentially irreplaceable, Spike didn't experience any dramatic balance changes in beta for the most part, a couple tweaks here and there, but besides that fat health nerf Spike got right out of the gate, he never caused any disasters or gave the dev team much trouble. In fact, he only had 7 balance changes across the entire 18-month-long beta, roughly half as much as other complex brawlers like Mortis and Crow. You know, I wish I had some funky stuff to show you about beta Spike, but he was just fundamentally designed really solidly and played that way too. If there was an aggressive brawler, Spike could shut them down from up close, and if there wasn't, Spike still had the range to at least poke at the enemy snipers and control brawlers. It gave players the sense of Spike always feeling useful, which would eventually cause a lot of different problems in Spike players down the line, but we'll get to that later. For now, just know Spike stayed pretty consistent and was really good by the end of beta. Which takes us to global Brawl Stars with Spike squarely in S tier, boasting his reliable, all-rounder capabilities that made him a top 3 brawler. While the game's global launch came with a lot of exciting features, nothing mechanically changed about Spike. In fact, the most significant change he got was a remodel in early 2019 that basically just cleaned him up. So basically nothing changed about Spike in the first 6 months of Global, but what did change was the game around him. New brawlers released in early Global like Carl and Jean took over the meta Brawler Spike didn't have great matchups into, and because the early Global meta developed while Spike stayed the same, he fell off to being a good brawler but not quite top 3 anymore by mid-2019. That would all change, however, as he received a new game-changing ability in July, quite possibly humanity's gravest mistake in all observable history. His second star power, Curveball. Up to this point, I hadn't yet mentioned Spike's first star power, Fertilize, and that's because it wasn't particularly game-breaking. Fertilize was interesting though because it didn't synergize with how Spike wanted to use his super normally. Now, in addition to his super's usual effect of damaging enemies and slowing them, it would also heal Spike over time when he stood over it. This rare piece of depth in Spike's playstyle would eventually be taken away from us, but I'm getting ahead of myself. This complexity was rarely seen at the time because there was a bigger problem we had to worry about. The problem was that Curveball was just a menace, okay? This was a buffed version of Curveball that immediately became his better star power and propelled him back to S tier again. It had double the angle and range of the modern base version, making it way harder to dodge. Additionally, most players today have months, maybe years of experience dodging Curveball. It's almost a rite of passage now for players to learn to dodge it when taking the game more seriously. But when Curveball was first released, everyone was cooked. Basically, no one knew what to do, and you can see how this got very annoying very quick. Even 2 buffs in a row to Fertilize wasn't enough to get most players to stop using it. While Spike didn't explicitly counter a lot of the top meta brawlers in mid-2019, he still countered several meta picks, namely the newly released BB and Rosa, as well as Daryl and Leon. As long as Spike still had good matchups like these in the meta, he was always relevant and always felt like a safe pick. Supported by his new OP star power, Spike was comfortably S tier after July, though inevitably, Curveball was eventually nerfed 4 months after its release, having both its angle and distance. This brought Spike back to mid tier in November 2019, a very deserved, very reasonable change. As such, you could expect Supercell to leave Spike in this position since it was pretty healthy. But Spike got a buff instead. This was an interesting but very deliberate decision. Spike was not terrible by any means. In fact, he was still held in really high regard in the casual meta. Yet, despite these circumstances, Supercell rewarded Spike with buffs to his main attack damage and Curveball star power in early 2020. Curveball's strength was admittedly severely screwed over, but I don't see that as a major problem that needed addressing. What was so bad about Spike being just alright instead of great? Supercell clearly wanted to maintain Spike's status as a solid brawler, but why? During this time, the meta of Brawl Stars was really starting to develop. New brawlers being released during this time, like Max and Mr. P, were gaining a lot of relevancy, complexity creeping older brawlers with their new utility. So to counteract this meta development, Spike received these buffs that ensured he stayed at a solid A tier, like Supercell's Golden Child that, up to this point, had never been a bad brawler across his entire lifespan. Yet, what the community didn't know at the time was that this was a trend that would stubbornly continue to persist. Around this time in early 2020, Spike also received his very first gadget, Popping Pincushion. This gadget was met with a very resounding it's okay. Not a useless atrocity to the point that it's funny, but not very transformative of Spike's kit either. It sent waves of needles around Spike in a 360, which has good burst potential up close, especially to stationary targets like the high safe, but that's about it. Basically, it just accentuates a thing Spike is already very good at. It doesn't really cover up any of his weaknesses or offers any interesting utility. One thing about the old version of this gadget is that it was affected by Curveball, which is actually kinda neat. It made it a little easier to hit out of range and was an explicit synergy between a gadget and star power, which is fairly uncommon. But they removed this feature in May, and to be honest, I don't know why. By the midpoint in the year, Spike was doing just fine. He was a high mid-tier brawler that played really well into enough meta picks like the newly released Jackie to still be relevant. And yet, Spike still got a damage buff and super recharge buff in September, rising back to the top of the meta by the end of 2020, all according to Supercell's wishes for the game's pseudo mascot. Since just by his sheer number of appearances and promotional material, it was starting to emerge that Spike was intended to become one of the faces faces of the game. Spike got a small slap on the wrist just as 2020 was ending, increasing his reload speed from 2 seconds to 2.1. And while this change made Spike a little worse, what Supercell didn't realize is that this change would be completely unnecessary. Because what would cause Spike's first recession wouldn't be a balance change, but a meta shift. So, up till this point, Spike's role as an anti-tank never really held him back, right? There were always enough aggro melee brawlers in the meta for Spike to be relevant, and the long-ranged anti-tank role was still a market Spike had close to a monopoly on. But in early 2021, the meta shifted around Spike in a way he despised. The meta brawlers of this time were the newest brawlers, Stu and Bell, as well as other thrower, control, and support brawlers that had all been buffed. For example, Sprout and Barley had just received damage buffs, and Sandy and Poco had just received supercharge rate buffs. All of these brawlers created a nightmare meta for Spike. These brawlers all either outranged Spike or had more utility than him. Spike wants an aggressive melee meta to truly shine, and this particular era in 2021 wasn't giving it to him. So, assuming how undesirable this meta was for Spike, you could assume he finally faded off to irrelevancy and took a backseat as a useless low tier. Except you were here for my whole monologue I made at the start of this video about Spike's consistency, and you know that Spike stayed around a mid-tier brawler. His stats were just so solid and Spike was so well-rounded that he couldn't be terrible. Supercell even gave Spike his 0.1 seconds of reload speed back, you know, as a pound in the back, just to make sure he was doing alright. And this tiny recession in Spike's career wouldn't last long at all. In July of 2021, Spike would receive his second gadget, Life Plant. This gadget was an immense improvement from his first. You remember what I said about popping Pincushion only supporting what Spike was already good at and not really adding utility to his kit? Well, Life Plant summoned a cactus at Spike's location that tanked 3500 HP and healed 1000 when it went down. This was a huge win for Spike fans. One of his major weaknesses was his low HP, which made him extremely vulnerable in long-ranged battles since he could only tickle enemies from afar while he would perish in only 2 taps. With Life Plant though, Spike could alleviate his HP weakness by hiding behind essentially a giant meat shield that had even more HP than he did. This also added utility to Spike's kit with its healing, and while it was only 1000 at the time, keep in mind HP was less inflated in 2021. In fact, every number in Brawl was because upgrades used to boost stats by 5% instead of 10. So relative to Spike's health, Life Plant actually healed just as much as it does today and had a way more impressive HP stat. Spike went from having a low tier gadget to having a top tier one, and along with a few aggro brawlers rising in the meta again like Buzz, Leon, and Mortis, Spike was once again a top tier brawler by late 2021. With the addition of Life Plant, Spike would remain a top tier brawler for half a year, and by this point, the idea that Spike was shockingly consistent had started to emerge. Players were realizing just how good Spike had been, especially in the casual meta most of the time. And while this was seen in a positive light at the moment, that wouldn't always be the case. This led until April of 2022 when Spike's gadget would eventually be humbled. Life Plant was crippled from its 3500 HP down to only 1750. However, Spike was too well established in his reign as a premier, well-balanced anti-tank. As long as he wasn't in a particularly nightmarish meta, Spike was so well-rounded he could find value even when Life Plant lost half its bulk. As a result, Spike fell from being a top 5 S tier brawler to being about high A tier, solid for sure, arguably top 10, but not undeniably meta-defining. And that's precisely what Spike had been good at, never being explicitly bad, just sticking around even through unfavorable metas or balance changes. Spike's consistency, however, was really put to the test for this stretch of time, as Spike was left completely alone for a year straight. From mid-2022 to mid-2023, Spike received 0 balance changes, and throughout all that time, meta shifts, power creep, over a dozen new brawlers. What would come of Spike's relevancy? Well, Spike held on pretty well, actually. Nothing eventful happened, and the cactus simply just doesn't go away. It depends on who you asked, but the general consensus was that Spike was about A tier around this time. His reliable DPS made him a safe option in Gem Grab, Brawl Ball, and sometimes Hot Zone, and there's just always a solid handful of brawlers Spike plays really well into. It's extremely rare for tanks and aggro brawlers to be completely irrelevant at any given time, so Spike always found some value in every meta. Spike's dry spell of balance changes ended with pretty unremarkable buffs to his less popular kit options in June of 2023, though a few months later came a change that would impact Brawl Stars a whole lot more. Spike's Hypercharge Blooming Season was among the first wave of hypercharges ever introduced to Brawl Stars in September of 2023. Blooming Season had the fascinating effect of making his super bigger, which a lot of the first hypercharges did actually. In fact, the entire Ranger Ranch trio just had their supers increased in size. TLDR, Spike's hypercharge effect was pretty boring and was pretty okay. In fact, a problem with hypercharges that appeared with this very first batch was that the stat boosts alone sometimes impacted these brawlers as much as the abilities themselves. Like, yes, it was nice to get a fatter super sometimes, and it did cover a huge part of the map, but a huge benefit of this hypercharge was the speed, shield, and damage boosts you would get. Just random power spikes you would get during the match that weren't particularly interesting and just made you straight up stronger than the enemy team. I'm kinda glad Supercell really toned down the stat boost for all the hypercharges down the line because it was pretty unsatisfying to play against. After this hypercharge, Spike went from being a solid mid-tier brawler to a top 10 brawler in the game, since he was one of only 6 brawlers who had access to these late game stat boosts. It is worth mentioning that this hypercharge had great synergy with his mythic gear at the time, which increased the slow of his super by 50%, meaning if you got trapped in this hyper super, escaping was basically impossible. The area was just too large and you could barely move too. This synergy was annoying enough that it pushed Supercell to eventually nerf the mythic gear at the end of 2023, which, alongside the next few waves of hypercharges releasing, knocked Spike down from being easily S tier to a solid high tier brawler nonetheless. Like many early hypercharges though, Spike's was eventually reworked in early 2024. After this, his hypercharge lost most of its shield boost and also charged slower. But his hypercharge at least got a small damage boost to show for it, and by the end, Spike was completely fine. However, in April of 2024 came a terrible change for Spike that would impact not only his standing in the meta for this era, but also his entire legacy. Supercell added this skin into the game. They also gave Spike a damage nerf. At face value, it didn't look the most significant, reducing the damage of each of his 6 spikes from 1120 to 1080 at max level, which is only a 4% damage decrease. However, this diminished the one thing Spike was used for just in time for him to be caught in another dreaded control meta. Just look at this tier list from Spen at the time, and I don't really have to explain to you what was so bad about it for the Cactus. Spike had hardly any good matchups against the A or S tier brawlers everyone was drafting, leading him to falling out of the high tier his hypercharge brought him. Following his small damage nerf in April, Spike was left to his own devices for 4 months in 2024. And what Spike fans might not have seen coming was just how terribly he'd be power crept during this short span of time. By the tail end of 2024, the formula that had been working so consistently for Spike's entire 7-year career crumbled. This legendary streak he had built for years only took a couple months to be broken in maybe the most rapid era of power creep yet. Spike had neither the damage nor the broken hypercharge needed to compete at the highest level because other anti-tanks were now getting their hypercharges and rising. Meanwhile, Spike was probably not clutching up any last-second team wipes or resetting gem grab counters with just his hyper super. This was not 2019 anymore. Spike had real, genuine competition for his anti-tank role, and Spike was falling behind. His damage output was even getting power crept by brawlers he was supposed to handle. New gen assassins of the time like Kenji and Hypercharged Daryl outright beat Spike in 1v1s. It was already going to be bad to begin with, and this damage nerf was basically preemptive salt in the wound for the worst era of power creep Spike would ever experience. Just over the summer, pros who had been consistently rating Spike at least mid-tier for 7 years started rating him lower and lower and lower until he was squarely a D-tier brawler by October of 2024. Finally, after a generational run as at minimum a good brawler, Spike was competitively unviable. This was reflected in the 2024 Brawl Stars World Finals in November that year, where Spike was not picked or banned a single time in all the matches, compared to the 2023 World Finals where Spike was in the top 10 most played. With Spike's total absence from the game's biggest competitive stage that year, Supercell tried to buff Spike's performance soon after. Just 11 days after the tournament's end, Spike's base health, life plant gadget, and fertilized star power were all buffed in hopes of improving Spike's survivability, and these changes were in fact duplicate buffs from the end of the summer that I didn't even mention. Twice in a row across 3 months did Supercell buff Spike's health, life plant gadget, and fertilize. But that doesn't address the real problem. The truth was, even a 16% health buff wasn't gonna help Spike beat Kenji, Shade, Melody, Hypercharged Daryl. What would help him win would be for his burst damage, the thing he's supposed to be best at, to be threatening once again. The buffs were nice, dragging him out of low tier and into about mid tier, but Spike players had been so used to his consistency that this was still part of the downturn. This was the position Spike used to be in even the most unfavorable of metas, and now this was where he was right after 2 waves of buffs in a meta he should theoretically play okay into. He should be able to address the Franks and Kenjis of the game that were so meta defining in late 2024, but his damage just wasn't good enough to warrant his use over other anti-tanks. And so this became Spike's greatest downfall. Following the longest era of competitive relevance the game had ever seen, Spike collapsed to true and utter mediocrity. Spike was ignored for another 8 months, a sign of detachment from Supercell that was quite unlike them leading up to this point. Supercell had been pretty diligent keeping Spike solid in the past, but had maybe finally decided that enough was enough, cause if any brawler were to be the most consistent in history, would we want it to be Spike? Clearly Supercell did for a while. I mean, it makes sense, Spike is basically a mascot for Brawl Stars. But from a game design perspective, Spike's one of the most low skill anti-tanks in the entire game. Take Curveball into account and Spike becomes a notorious noob stomper who doesn't take much mechanical skill to play with. There isn't much drafting skill there either because historically Spike is usually just decent in every situation, which makes you wonder if this Hall of Fame career would have been better if granted to a different brawler. A brawler who doesn't feel so generalist and isn't so prone to overuse by the broad player base. Maybe Spike was finally allowed to be mediocre for a while. Maybe this era of irrelevancy was the change of pace players were waiting for so that when Spike did eventually come back, we could actually appreciate him again. After only receiving a pitifully small gadget cooldown buff in July, Spike rounded out a full year in competitive irrelevancy. And for a second year in a row, Spike was unpicked and unbanned at the World Finals, something completely unheard of for the brawler who had been so consistent the first 7 years of the game. Was this just a bad era, or was Spike's golden age truly over? That was the question plaguing the minds of Spike mains as the last wave of brawlers finally got their hypercharges in late 2025. And what these Spike mains didn't know was that in preparation for the hypercharge era ending, Supercell had been cooking their newest idea for abilities that would forever change the world of Brawl once again. Twice in a row, Spike and the rest of his trio were the guinea pigs for the newest abilities introduced to Brawl Stars. As such, Spike served as a prime example for how Supercell intended to rework some old brawlers to better fit the modern scope of the game. Popping Pincushion went from its 360 to an aimable attack, while Life Plant could now be thrown. Besides the gadgets, Fertilize was also completely reformed. Its once counterintuitive use case became way more streamlined. Fertilize's healing was now a simple lifesteal. So instead of getting the choice of whether to use your super on the enemy or on yourself, you would just passively get the healing automatically as it damaged opponents. This sounds great and all, but unfortunately, this has been quite possibly the most hated star power rework yet, at least from Buffy's anyway. Many players argue this star power became a whole lot less interesting. Spike is already kind of a classic newbie pick, you know, a comfort brawler you can turn your brain off with and feel like you're doing something. The small decision that came with Fertilize, however, whether to heal yourself or to throw your super away from you, was one of the tiny instances where you had to fire a neuron to operate this character. But then it was just ripped away from us. and also made way worse, which means players had to use Curveball. It was the way of life with how bad Fertilize was. It had a situational use case and didn't even heal much anyway. Lucky for Curveball though, it got a range buff with its Buffie, but unlucky for it, it also didn't get any more angular to compensate. Basically, Curveball just didn't turn as harshly as it used to, so actually some players reported Curveball feeling easier to dodge after this Buffie, which is kinda strange. Spike star powers will likely receive changes in the future, though it's interesting how Buffy's intended to rework certain brawlers, yet the one thing that stayed consistent for Spike is Curveball still being annoying and one of the most conceptually despised star powers in the entire game. Switching tracks, however, his Hyper Buffy basically makes his main attack explode twice, which I don't have a super long tangent about this one. It just gave his Hyper a more obvious power spike. It's strong, but it just doesn't see as much use throughout the entire match. Really, the gadgets were the real demons here. With Buffy's, popping Pincushion now rooted enemies, basically guaranteeing kills even more than it already did. It was really dumb, kinda like his life playing gadget now exploding on death. Overall, Spike's Buffies and reworks came with conflicted feelings. On one hand, the intention of Spike's Buffies feel good. You know, unlike Spike's painfully boring hypercharge, these Buffies actually meaningfully changed Spike in some way. On the other hand, Spike's balance got thrown way out of whack. He became entirely a Curveball merchant with the assassination of Fertilize and became obnoxiously gadget reliant after their reworks and Buffies. You thought life plan after all these buffs was a problem? Popping Pincushion was a menace. It dealt over 5,000 damage from point blank. By itself, no ammo required, while rooting enemies. Ultimately though, that's kinda just the nature of how Buffy's felt. All 6 of the first wave of Buffy brawlers became top tier, and Spike was just not an exception. Spike was back in S tier and enjoyed his strongest competitive state in years for a solid 5 weeks. Though by the turn of the year in January of 2026, reality hit for Spike. Before the end of February in 2026, Spike already got 2 big waves of nerfs, both mostly targeted towards his unreal gadgets. The first victim, popping Pincushion, dealt 5,400 damage at point blank before the nerfs, and afterwards only dealt 3,000. It also lost the ability to charge Spike's super, which I don't even know why I did that in the first place, dude. On the other hand, Life Plant's cooldown went from every 14 seconds to every 20. And as a bonus, Spike's Hypercharge also got a charge nerf as well. But again, Spike's Buffies had done too much harm. He was still one of only 12 brawlers in the game with Buffies at all, which, similar to when he got his Hypercharge, made him top tier by default. But little did Spike mains know, a third wave of nerfs was coming. A third month in a row where Spike received nerfs. And while Spike appeared to have dealt with the first 2 waves just fine, it only softened him up for the real kicker that was coming in March. In March of 2026, Spike got a supercharge rate nerf. More importantly though, he also received his first main attack damage nerf in 2 years. And just as how his last damage nerf immediately preceded his worst downfall, this damage nerf would dig another. Except this change itself was a whole lot worse. To address Spike's insanely consistent performance the past 4 months, his main attack damage was nerfed by 9%, which is a massive deal. Remember when we went over how power crept Spike's damage output became in comparison to other anti-tanks? Even before this nerf, that problem still applied. It's just that Spike got these fancy new toys that patched up that hole, particularly his gadget reworks and Buffies that were way too strong. Yet, instead of fully addressing these problems, Spike's completely unproblematic main attack was assassinated. His damage potential became such a shadow of its former self that he was hardly even an anti-tank anymore. He was just a bad generalist, a comfort noob stomper pick that wasn't the most suitable counter for basically anything. This was all in time for Brawl Cup in May of 2026, one of the biggest Brawl Stars tournaments of the year, where Spike was a completely unpicked and unbanned brawler again. The only Buffied brawler in the game to be so neglected competitively, literally in the bottom 18% of brawlers that saw no representation. Which leans into what I said about Spike's Buffies being okay in spirit but less in practice. What Spike's Buffies wanted to do was introduce fun utility into his kit to help him navigate modern aggressive metas, maybe streamline his fertilized star power a bit and make his kit feel alive again. But instead, his fertilized star power was murdered, leaving him almost forced to use what some people argue to be the worst designed star power in the entire game, and his gadgets were wildly overtuned with reworks and buffies, leaving his base kit to get demolished to compensate, which accidentally ruined his entire niche. But then, as I was just outlining this script, ready to tie the story in a neat ribbon and bow about the rise and fall of Spike, and to ask you all to check if you're subscribed because I'm trying to hit 20,000, a new post caught my eye. The newest balance changes of June 2026 were announced early, and to my surprise, I saw Spike's pin on that list with a massive buff listed beside him.
It's too much for a main attack that can curve. You know the drama with Spike. He's really unskillful with his main attacks. We'd never want Spike to be too strong competitively speaking because he can be a big problem.
This is just gonna be like an obnoxious brawler again.
And that's just too much damage for curveball is so easy to hit. Again, I might give them a bit of feedback on that.
Yeah, I don't know. I was kind of happy that Spike was bad.
But it's been buffed by 22%. That sounds ludicrous because I don't like Spike being meta personally.
Why were some players not excited to see this change? So, the damage buff actually turned out to be a lot smaller than what they originally planned. At first, his damage was getting buffed by 22%, and now it's toned down to only 14, shifting from the largest damage buff Spike would ever receive by a mile to still a big buff, but a little more normal. But that says a lot about the community feedback Brawl Stars was given. This buff was one of the few changes that were adjusted from the work in progress, showing that the reception to Spike's buff was pretty negative. So why was the community so unwilling to see Spike be a top-tier anti-tank again? Why was the feedback substantial enough to force Brawl Stars to not return Spike to top tier like they have before? I think there are a few reasons, but I'll start with Spike's consistency we just spent all this time looking over. For one, I think Spike has been meta enough times that I think it's natural for longtime players to not care for playing against this brawler anymore. You really do need the lows to appreciate the highs. Sure, Spike was pretty bad for that one period after Hypercharge and for about 3 months after Buffy's, but he was good and more importantly, used frequently basically every other time. It seems as long as Spike's decent, he's an inevitability to play against. Regardless of how you feel about Spike's gameplay mechanics at all, just through sheer frequency, this return is not that exciting. Spike is usually babied by Supercell's balance team. I mean, it makes sense, he's not definitively, but kinda like a mascot for Brawl Stars, right? As far as I know, he has the most animation appearances, and the guy even has a grass statue at Supercell HQ. He's simply just one of the most popular brawlers for the broad player base, so it makes sense why Spike has been kept consistent throughout his history to make sure players have fun with him. But a problem is that I think this has had the opposite effect on how the more dedicated community views Spike in modern day. If Spike was just a little worse on average, news of a potential buff like this might actually cause more excitement. And that leads into the second point that some players argue they don't want a brainless all-purpose anti-tank like Spike to reach top tier again. At the time of me writing this, why do you think Otis is arguably the premier anti-tank in the meta, but hardly anyone riots that he needs to be nerfed? It's because Otis isn't perceived as such a brainless generalist that low-skill players can constantly insta-lock him and reap the benefits. Spike, on the other hand, is in the top 10 most picked brawlers from Bronze 1 to Masters. Curveball doesn't depend on you, it depends on the opponent. And if your opponent is a Diamond 2 peak, it probably works out well for you. So when met with this proposed damage buff, the community immediately pushed back because players who insta-lock Spike would start feasting again. Low ladder players who don't know how to dodge curveball would suffer even more at the hands of a broken Spike, while competitive players would have to deal with this brain-dead cactus in the meta yet again. However, there's still this vast majority of the player base, the side that doesn't really care about the metagame or how long Spike has been good or if he's brain dead sometimes, the casual players who simply love Spike and just enjoy getting to play their favorite brawler. So is Spike's return to the meta, whether with this next buff or in the foreseeable future, something everyone's excited for? I don't think so, but there are so many players who appreciate Spike that this keeps happening. Are you excited for Spike to be good anymore? Should Spike's GOAT legacy be extended across time or be left in the past as a fond, distant memory? Okay, thanks so much for watching this one. I hope you found it interesting, and if you did, please consider subscribing. It helps me out a lot, and I truly appreciate each and every one of you. You. Yeah, you right there.